Downward facing dog is the foundational pose for almost everything on the hands, even handstand. And it's such a great posture. We teach it so much in our classes that it's so important that we really understand how to verbally cue it, because our verbal cues are what is going to help our students really understand the nuances of the pose. So I'm going to break it down piece by piece, following the body. I always start with the most delicate part of the foundation. Virginie is going to come into downward facing dog. And in downward facing dog, there are two sets of foundations. There's the hands and the feet. The feet don't really, aren't as delicate as the hands, arms, and shoulders. You're bearing more weight. So that's where I always start. Now, before I verbally cue something, I always look for misalignments, because misalignments are what really help me understand how to cue that person into it. That said, I will generalize the verbal cues as well. So when looking at downward facing dog, I always start from the front. And most common misalignments are lack of engagement in the hands. So go ahead and show us what that looks like, Virg. The index finger knuckles lift, which sends the weight into the outer wrist. Sometimes the elbows bend and the arm bones, the upper arm bones internally rotate. So we see this a lot in our yoga classes, and it's not great. It hurts the wrist, hurts the elbows, hurts the shoulders, right? So from here, I make sure that the fingers are spreading wide, the hands are shoulders distance. And I'm saying this, spread your fingers wide, make sure your hands are realistically shoulders distance. If they have trouble with straightening the arms, the elbows bend, I like turning the hands out just slightly. Turning the hands out so that the index finger knuckles point forward really helps with wrist issues and any sort of shoulder pain. But Virginie was fine. Don't go further than middle fingers forward. Now, grabbing with the fingertips is so important. It actually takes the position of the hand from flexion or from extension into flexion. And when I cue, I always cue with counter cues. So when she grips the ground with the fingertips, it actually turns on the forearm muscles, which protects the wrists. She's going to counter that by rooting through the index finger knuckles. Two cues in the hands that are so important. Grip with the fingertips and counter that by pushing down through the index finger knuckles. Now we move up the arm. Two things going on that are completely separate in the arms. The forearms firm inwards. You could even teach pronation in the forearms. You need to counter that by either externally rotating the upper arm bones or spreading the shoulder blades wide, okay? So firm the forearms in or pronate while externally rotating the upper arm bones or spreading the shoulder blades wide. She's gonna take a rest. Come on down. Down dog can be a very challenging pose to hold. So this might be the first video you're watching in this plan, which I hope it is, because this is the foundation of all of the other postures. And you'll notice I cue in counters, because what counter cueing does is that it sets up the body for muscular engagement. And that's just incredibly important. It's also isometrics. When one part of the body does one thing and another part does another, then the muscles are engaged protecting the joints. Come on back in. Okay, so a lot of what happens with downward facing dog, especially if you've been practicing yoga for a long time or even teaching it, we get all these different cues. And one of the most damaging cues, in my opinion, is press the chest back. Press your chest back too far. So notice as she presses her chest back too far, it actually dumps her shoulders back, and she's internally rotating the arm bones, the upper arm bones, which causes impingement in the front of the shoulder, specifically in the rotator cuff. So again, she grips with a fingertip. And when she grips with the fingertips, it will actually lift her up slightly. You can also, if you see that pushed back variation of down dog, you can also cue your student to move slightly forward with the shoulders or lift the forearms away from the ground, okay? Hugging the forearms in, spreading the shoulder blades wide. Another misalignment that happens here is the dumping of the ribs. Go ahead and dump your ribs, which is also the dumping of the shoulders. So tapping the ribs or verbally cueing, draw your ribs and your navel in. Notice how she overdoes that and it actually domes her lower back. This is coming to now the practitioner who's really, really tight. So tighten round your back body. Yes. So somebody who's really tight from here to here, you'll see a lot of this. For the most part, in the upper body, the cueing stays the same. In the lower body here, if you find somebody who's really tight, cue a little bend in the knees and cue them to really stick their booty up. I like to think a bit of Beyonce, all right? And it's a bit counterintuitive because as yogis, we're always saying, draw the navel in, but actually a bit of that anterior pelvic tilt will help that tighter practitioner find more space. And once they find that space in the sides of the waist, then they can begin to slowly straighten the legs, and that could be over time. If you have a dumping sort of action going on, like what she did just then, the ribs flaring out, you can cue your practitioner to draw the navel in and lengthen through the sides of the waist. Rest. Okay, so we did the hands, the arms, the shoulders. The cues in the torso area are basically the same for most practitioners, except that if you're tighter, you'll want to do a bit more anterior pelvic tilt. And if you're more flexible already in that anterior pelvic tilt, then drawing the navel in will neutralize the pelvis. Last piece is the legs. Come on into downward facing dog. So the leg cueing will be based on, again, the tightness or the flexibility in the body. We always have balance or center as our goal, and then there are people who are going to be tighter or more flexible. So how do we get them to come to balance with our verbal cues, right? So it's all about the femurs and the rotation of the femurs, which means a lot of us will cue inner thighs back. Now, not everybody needs just inner thighs back. Remember, throughout the body, I've cued counter cues. And I do this because then I'm talking to the full spectrum of practitioners. So just drawing the inner thighs back, or internal rotation of the femurs really helps people who are tighter in the back body. But for someone like me with weak knees and flexible hips, it could actually hurt me. So I want you to accompany inner thighs back with drawing the outer hips back and in. Those two cues together will not only lengthen the spine and the muscles around it, but also help your practitioners, regardless of their flexibility or tightness, find that balance in the engagement of the muscles. And so drawing the outer hips back and in helps to, in a sense, externally rotate the femurs, the thigh bones, but then drawing the inner thighs back will help to internally rotate, finding balance. In terms of muscular engagement, drawing the outer hips back and in engages the glutes. So important. So many of us yogis think, oh, don't engage the glutes. No, the glutes are so important. It's when you externally rotate the thigh bones that it starts to hurt you. So outer hips back and in engages the glutes. Inner thighs back helps to engage the adductors. Now your legs are really, really working. And whether the heels touch the ground or not, this is a big misconception in yoga. They don't need to touch the ground. But finding heavy heels rooting down towards the earth can really help someone lengthen their back body. Okay, just going to recap. Counter cues in the upper body. Grip with the fingertips, root down through the index finger knuckles. Those are the hands. Counter cues in the arms. Firm the forearms in or pronate while you externally rotate the upper arm bones or spread the shoulder blades wide. Draw the ribs and the navel in, but counter that by drawing the outer hips up and back. Then a slight internal rotation of the inner thighs drawing back as the heels root firmly down towards the earth. Take a child's pose. Hopefully that was helpful for you. I found it really helpful to look at the body in these counter cue ways, and you'll see all of these cues show up throughout the rest of the postures on this journey. Thank you so much for joining me.